Now let's talk just a little bit more about the primary cortices of each of our lobes. So one of the things that's kind of interesting, I mentioned that there is functional specialization in the brain, and that's very true. So we've already talked about Broca's area, which is important for language production. So if you damage this area, you can understand language, but you can't speak it. Over here in the temporal lobe, we actually have this area called Wernicke's area. This area is really important for language comprehension. So if this part of the brain is damaged, you can speak language, but it really won't make a lot of sense because you can't understand it. Now, in addition to this, each of our four lobes has what we call a primary cortex. So what this means is that for the most part, this is the first place in the brain that deals with a particular sense. So in the occipital lobe, the first place in the cortex that vision is processed is called the primary visual cortex. In the temporal lobe, we can see that the first place where hearing is processed is the primary auditory cortex. Our sense of touch is first processed in the primary somatosensory cortex. Now, here's where it gets a little complicated. The motor cortex is different. The primary motor cortex is the last place in the cortex that processes motor commands before they're sent to the body. So, whereas all of the other ones are the first place in the cortex to process that particular sense, motor is the last place. Now, what's kind of interesting is that both your motor and somatosensory cortex have a map of the body on them. So right now, let's take a look at the primary motor cortex. Areas that require more complicated movements have more cortex devoted to them. So in particular, some of the most complicated movements that we do are with our faces to produce language and also with our hands. And so what you'll notice is that a good chunk of the motor cortex is devoted to those parts. To a lesser extent, we have parts like the elbow, the arm, the shoulder, which tend to be a lot less complicated in terms of their movements. Now, in the somatosensory cortex, the same rule applies. Areas of the body that are more sensitive have more cortex devoted to them. And just as we saw with the motor cortex, the primary somatosensory cortex has a large part devoted to, again, the face and the hands. And in this particular case, it's because we do a lot of work in exploring with the world and learning about the world through our hands. And we also do a lot of exploring, especially with respect to things like food or when we're talking. We need a bodily sense. We need to be able to feel touch to be able to process speaking. So as you can see, this creates what is called a homunculus. It's like a human that's being mapped on the cortex. And this human has a big head and big hands. Now, a special area that I want to talk about is the prefrontal cortex. This occupies a whole 30% of our brain. In general, this is probably the largest proportion of any animal. And the prefrontal cortex is responsible for a lot of the things that we tend to think of as making us uniquely human. Controlling our judgment and behaviors so we behave in socially appropriate ways, emotional responses, as well as paying attention. This area is really critical for things like rational thought, our sense of self, as well as socially appropriate behavior. And if you want to figure out what happens when that prefrontal cortex is damaged, you have nowhere further to look than the case of Phineas Gage. And now I shall show you a small video. what we find in this particular case, and this is very much a true story, Phineas Gage had damage to his bilateral orbitofrontal cortex, part of the prefrontal cortex. And one of the things that we tended to find is that his sense of self fundamentally changed. He was much more irritable, much more prone to anger, and things like that. So the prefrontal cortex really makes up a lot of who we are. Now, with the time that we have left, I would like to talk about our peripheral nervous system. So I've spent a lot of time talking about the central nervous system and the brain. Now it's time to talk a little bit about the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is really important for us because it helps our brain and our bodies communicate. So the peripheral nervous system helps send information from our senses to our brain, and we also receive messages from the brain to help guide our bodies. And as you learned about today in class, there are two major divisions. There's the somatic or skeletal nervous system, and there's the autonomic. So you can see our different divisions here. We talked about our central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Now we're talking about our peripheral nervous system. Our somatic or skeletal nervous system is designed to respond to sensory input. So what happens with this system is that it transmits signals to the brain and spinal cord and from the brain and spinal cord through our nerves, bundles of neurons that are not attached to the brain or the spinal cord. And this allows us to make voluntary movements based on what's going on around us. These nerves are connected to things like the muscles, the joints, the skin, and so on. Many of our voluntary reflexes are based on this system. Now, in contrast, the autonomic nervous system is designed to actually regulate our body. And this is because the autonomic nervous system helps stimulate our glands and our internal organs. As we talked about earlier today, there are two major divisions, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic system. The sympathetic nervous system is designed to help energize our body. So it gives us the energy that we need to either fight or run away from challenges or threats. In contrast, the parasympathetic nervous system helps to calm us down. So what kind of things happen with the sympathetic nervous system? One of the things that you're going to notice that's kind of interesting, all of these nerves make connections to these glands and organs through different sections of spinal cord. And what you'll notice is that the nerves that are responsible that attach to the spinal cord occupy different areas. So the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system never occupy the same section of spinal cord. So the sympathetic nervous system is designed to give us energy. So what kind of things happen when we need energy? One of the first things that we'll see is our pupils will dilate, our heart rate will accelerate. This will also raise our blood pressure. Digestion will be inhibited. One of the ways that you can kind of see this is that if you ever go do a workout, one of my favorite things to do, as silly as this is feel my stomach after a run. And part of the reason for that is because my stomach is so cold. Now, what you may not be aware of is that physical activity is technically a form of stress, and that kickstarts your sympathetic nervous system. So I've got blood rushing to the muscles that I am using to run. Anything that's not necessary at that point, particularly digestion, will be abandoned. So blood flow that would normally be going to digestion is now going to my leg muscles and helping me run. So what happens when you're done with the physical activity, your stomach is very, very cold because digestion is inhibited. The liver will help stimulate glucose release, so your blood sugar will rise. Glucose is a source of energy. Your adrenal glands will secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, and the bladder will relax. Now, in contrast, the parasympathetic nervous system is going to do the exact opposite of everything that the sympathetic nervous system did. The pupils are going to contract, heart rate is going to slow, blood pressure is going to drop, blood sugar is going to drop, digestion is going to continue. The gallbladder will stimulate so that the glucose that isn't needed is used, and the bladder will contract. And it's for this reason that the sympathetic nervous system is sometimes referred to as fight or flight, and the parasympathetic nervous system is occasionally referred to as rest and digest. So now with the time that we have left, let's talk about nature and the role of nurture. Genes help affect our behavior. Genes function as a unit of heredity, and it partially determines many of our different characteristics, including our height, our eye color, our intelligence, and so on. Now, what's interesting is that your genetic makeup, your genotype, is set at birth and it never changes. You can't change your genes, but your environment actually helps influence whether or not certain genes are expressed. So one of the ways that researchers like to learn about the role of nature and nurture are by looking at twin studies. We can actually look at the differences between different types of twins. We can look at identical twins who share 100% of the same genes versus dizygotic twins, twins that come from different eggs and only share 50% of the same genes. We can also look at twins that are raised together versus raised apart to assess the role in environment. And so when you do a lot of these twin studies, you're engaging in what is known as behavioral genetics. You're looking at how genes and the environment interact to influence different aspects of psychology. And this is important because the environment shapes us. Our brain is capable of reorganizing itself in response to damage. So if you find very early on that you have a brain injury, exposure to new things and the fact that you're young can actually help you. And this is what is known as plasticity. Now, sometimes if you're older, the brain is not good at reorganizing itself. And we get something here called split brain syndrome. So I mentioned the corpus callosum, this fiber bundle that connects the two different hemispheres. And I mentioned that the left hemisphere tends to be for language, and that the right hemisphere is really not used in language. Some people have had to have their corpus callosums cut because of intractable epilepsy. The idea is that if you can keep the hemispheres from communicating with each other, you can reduce the severity of a seizure. And generally, this helps alleviate seizures, but you're left with a pretty horrific side effect. So if I project a star to your right visual field and I ask you what you saw, you'll be able to tell me. The reason for that is that the left side of the brain is responsible for your right visual field. This is what's known as being contralateral. And because the left hemisphere is for language, you're able to grab the word that you need and say, yeah, I saw a star. But what happens if I project a star to your left visual field? It projects to the right. Now, normally, if your corpus callosum was available, you'd be able to use the left hemisphere to get language. But because that connection's been cut, you can't. So one of the things that we find is that if damage happens late in life, your brain's not able to compensate, and somebody will report that they do not see anything. Now, that's all I have for right now. I think this should get you to the end of the week, but I will do another screencast about consciousness in the next few days. See you later.